This is Beyond the Business, Weekly Digest.
Over the past weeks, the global shipping industry has once again found itself adjusting to geopolitical tension in the Middle East. While much of the recent attention has focused on rising tensions around the Strait of Hormuz, the broader maritime system is still dealing with instability in another critical corridor, the Red Sea. Over the past year, attacks on commercial vessels in that region have repeatedly forced shipping companies to reconsider their routine decisions. For most people outside the shipping industry, these events appear as isolated headlines. Attacks on vessels warning from navies, shipping companies rerouting their fleets. Inside the logistics systems, however, the implications are much broader. Modern supply chains depend heavily on the small number of maritime corridors that function as the main arteries of global trade. When pressure appears in one of those arteries, the entire system begins to adjust. The Red Sea connects directly to the Suez Canal, and the Suez Canal has long been one of the most critical passages in global commerce. According to shipping industry estimates, roughly 12% of global trade and close to one-third of container traffic between Asia and Europe moves through the Suez Canal corridor. To understand the scale of this corridor, it helps to visualize the daily movement of ships. Under normal conditions, around 50 to 60 vessels pass through the Suez Canal every day. Over the course of a year, that translates into roughly 20,000 ships transiting the canal, carrying everything from consumer electronics and machinery to crude oil, LNG, and industrial raw materials. For container shipping, the route is particularly important because it connects two of the most powerful economic regions in the world: the manufacturing centers of East Asia and the consumer markets of Europe. For decades, this corridor represented the fastest and the most efficient maritime connection between those two regions. To understand why the current disruptions matter, it helps to briefly recall how the system normally works. In stable conditions, a container vessel leaving major Asian ports such as Shanghai, Ningbo, and Shenzhen sails across the South China Sea, passes through the Strait of Malacca, crosses the Indian Ocean, and enters the Red Sea. From there, the vessel transits the Suez Canal and continues into the Mediterranean before calling at major European ports such as Rotterdam, Antwerp, or Hamburg. The entire journey typically takes between 30 and 35 days, depending on vessel speed and the number of port calls. Shipping companies design the entire service network around these transit times. Vessel rotations, port bookings, container allocations, and inland distribution networks are all synchronized to match predictable arrival schedules. Modern container logistics works almost like a rhythm. Ships arrive at ports within scheduled time windows, containers are unloaded and transferred to trucks, trains, or warehouses. Export containers are loaded for the next voyage. When everything functions smoothly, the system appears almost invisible. But that stability depends heavily on reliable maritime corridors. When disruptions appear along one of these routes, the rhythm of the system begins to change. This is exactly what we are seeing today. Due to increasing security risks in the Red Sea region, many major shipping lines have chosen to reroute their vessels away from the Suez Canal. Instead of entering the Red Sea, ships continue south across the Indian Ocean and sail around the southern tip of Africa via the Cape of Good Hope. Historically, this route was the main maritime connection between Europe and Asia before the Suez Canal opened in 1869. Even today, it remains a viable alternative, but it comes with a significant difference: distance. Sailing around the Cape of Good Hope adds approximately 3.5 to 4,000 nautical miles to the typical Asia Europe voyage. In time terms, this means an additional 10 to 14 days at sea, depending on vessel speed and weather conditions. Inside the shipping industry, that change has immediate consequences. When a vessel spends 2 extra weeks completing a voyage, it cannot start its next voyage during that time. In other words, the global fleet effectively becomes smaller. The ships still exist, but they spend more time traveling, For logistics planners, this effect is similar to temporarily removing vessels from the market. With a few vessels available to perform scheduled voyages, freight capacity tightens and transportation costs begin to rise. We're already seeing early signs of this dynamic. Freight rates on Asia Europe routes have increased as shipping lines adjust their networks and absorb the longer sailing distances. Fuel consumption also increases significantly because vessels must travel much greater distances. For a large container vessel, fuel represents one of the biggest operating expenses. And more than ultra-large container ship can consume between 100 and 200 tons of fuel per day, depending on speed and weather conditions. Adding 10 additional sailing days therefore represents a considerable increase in operational cost. To understand how this feels from a maritime perspective, imagine a vessel leaving Singapore on a normal Asia-Europe rotation. Instead of turning north into the Red Sea after crossing the Indian Ocean, the vessel continues south toward the open waters of the South Atlantic. The familiar shipping lanes leading toward the Suez Canal disappear behind the ship, and the navigation plan changes entirely. The vessel now heads toward the Cape of Good Hope, and one of the most historically challenging maritime passages in the world. Weather conditions around the Cape can be far more demanding than those typically encountered inside the Red Sea corridor. Swells are larger, winds stronger, and distances between major ports much longer. For the crew on board, the change is not theoretical. Voyages become longer, fuel planning changes, arrival schedules at the European ports shift by days or even weeks. Port agents must renegotiate arrival windows, and terminal operators must adjust berth allocations. From the perspective of global supply chains, these operational details accumulate across hundreds of vessels performing the same rerouting. Another factor influencing routing decisions is insurance. When ships enter areas classified as high risk zones, insurers require additional war risk coverage. Premiums can increase dramatically depending on the perceived level of threat. For shipping companies, this becomes a crucial economic consideration. Even if the physical risk remains manageable, the cost of insurance can influence whether a route remains financially viable. In some cases, the insurance premiums associated with the entering a high risk area may exceed the additional fuel costs of taking a longer route around Africa. In other words, shipping routes are shaped not only by geography but also by financial risk calculations. This illustrates how closely modern logistics has become intertwined with the geopolitics. Shipping lanes are no longer simply maritime highways connecting ports. They exist within a broader system of security assessments, insurance markets, and geopolitical developments. From a supply chain perspective, this complexity creates both risk and resilience. Risk because disruptions can appear suddenly when geopolitical tension escalates. Resilience because the system has multiple alternative routes that can absorb pressure when necessary. We have already seen this resilience during previous crises. During the COVID 19 pandemic, global shipping experienced one of the largest disruptions in modern history. Ports became congested, containers accumulated in the wrong regions, and vessel schedules collapsed across major trade lanes. Yet, global trade continued functioning. Supply chains adjusted, shipping lines modified their routes and schedules, warehouses increased inventory buffers, retailers adapted delivery timelines. The system bent under pressure, but it did not break. We are seeing the same adaptive behavior today. Shipping companies adjust schedules, ports reorganize arrival windows, freight forwarders revise planning models, retailers update inventory strategies to account for longer transit times. So supply chains rarely stop functioning completely. Instead, they operate in what might be called adaptive mode. From outside the industry, the changes may appear dramatic. Ships changing routes, freight rates rising, and delivery timelines extending. Inside the system, these changes represent a continuous recalibration process. Looking ahead, the key question is how the situation may evolve if stability in the Red Sea regions continues. In the short term, supply chains will continue adapting through rerouting and schedule adjustments. Companies will incorporate longer transit times into their logistics planning. Shipping lines will allocate additional vessels where possible to maintain service frequency. Freight rates may fluctuate as capacity and demand rebalance. But if disruptions persist for several months or longer, deeper structural adjustments could begin to emerge. One possible shift involves inventory strategy. For decades, global supply chains were optimized for efficiency. Companies reduced inventory levels and relied on just in time delivery models to minimize storage costs. However, longer and less predictable transit times encourage companies to rebuild safety buffers. Warehouses may increase stock levels to protect against shipping delays. Distribution networks may incorporate additional storage capacity to maintain operational continuity. Another development could involve regional diversification of production. In recent years, manufacturers have already begun reconsidering the geographic distribution of their production networks. Nearshoring trends in North America have encouraged companies to expand manufacturing capacity in Mexico to serve the US market more directly. In Europe, similar discussions are taking place around reshoring certain strategic industries closer to regional demand centers. If maritime corridors remains unstable for extended periods, these regional supply chain strategies could accelerate. Companies may choose to distribute production more evenly across regions in order to reduce reliance on extremely long shipping routes. Alternative logistics corridors may also gain renewed attention. Rail routes connecting China with Europe through Central Asia and Eastern Europe have already been explored as supplementary freight options. While rail cannot replace maritime shipping in terms of volume, it can offer faster transit times for certain high value cargo categories. Finally, shipping companies themselves will continue adjusting operational strategies. Fleet deployment patterns may evolve as longer routes become temporarily integrated into service networks. Vessel speeds may change to balance fuel consumption and delivery reliability. Ports may expand operational flexibility to accommodate fluctuations in arrival schedules. In other words, the global logistics system will continue doing what it has always done, adapting. The lesson from the current situation is not that global trade is collapsing. Rather, it demonstrates how global supply chains respond dynamically when geopolitical conditions change. Ships reroute, schedules adjust, and costs fluctuate. But the flow of goods continues. The events unfolding in the Red Sea remind us of something fundamental. Global supply chains operate across the world, shaped not only by economics, but increasingly by geopolitics. Shipping routes, once optimized purely for efficiency, must now operate within an environment where security concerns, political tensions, and regional conflicts influence logistics decisions. For companies managing global supply chains, this means resilience has become just as important as efficiency. Routes may change, transit times may increase, and costs may fluctuate, yet the ships continue sailing. Ports continue operating, goods continue moving across oceans, because the global logistics system is not a rigid structure. It is a dynamic network constantly adjusting to the realities of the world it serves. And the development we are witnessing today in the Red Sea are simply the latest chapter in that ongoing story.